Okay.
Go.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. This is a bonus episode of the Team House. I'm Jack Murphy here with co-host Dave Park. And today we have a special guest on the show, Erfan Fard. He is a counter-terrorism analyst and Middle East studies researcher based in Washington, D.C., but currently living in Los Angeles. You can find him on Twitter at EQFard, EQFARD. He has published 8 books in Persian and Arabic. One of them after 60 years, which was the official biography of Jalal Talabani, the former president of Iraq. He is now publishing The Gruesome Mullah, which is about the Iranian regime, the IRGC, Mos Khomeini, and Khomeiniism. And his book has been excerpted or blurbed by Michael Morell, the former acting director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So, Erfan, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, guys, for having me, and I really appreciate it invitation.
So we have a list of questions here to just sort of run right into, so we're going to jump right into it. First things first, what can you tell us about Quds Force?
Actually, Quds Force is a branch of IRGC, which means this is the Iranian Secretive Force, and it's a terrorist military organization. The terrorist Quds Force is a part of this Revolutionary Guard, and they have a mission around Iran. Actually, it is designed as a terrorist foreign organization by United States and Europe also. And the Quds Force performs operations externally in Iran and to advance the Islamic terrorism, or we can say Khomeinism, which is an ideology of the Islamic Republic in Tehran. And the Quds Force has developed ties with other terrorist Shia militia groups and proxies in the region, for example, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, or Palestinian territories. And it's one of the dangerous transnational, we can say, criminal organization. Also, the Quds Force helped to mobilize and to lead tens of thousands of Shia radical militia against the U.S. forces in the recent decades. And I can say that 2 American generals, they describe Quds Force very professionally. One of them was General David Petraeus.
And I think the interesting thing a friend of mine told me about Quds Force is, I believe they're called the Bayads, where they're like commercial front companies that Quds Force runs to finance their own operations.
Actually, Quds Force, they try to finance all the operations or all the terrorist activities around the region, or in Latin America also, which is the backyard of the United States, because Quds Force, they wanted to defend the principles or ideologies of the Islamic Republic or mullahs in Tehran. And for the reason, from 2017, 2019, for 2 times, the United States, they designed that as a FTO, or Foreign Terrorist Organization.
And on that note, what is the relevancy of General Qasem Soleimani, who was killed last year? What was his relevance to Quds Force in the IRGC?
Actually, let me tell you something which is very clear. I personally believe that Soleimani had a destructive role in the region. He was main ally of Ahmad Mogheniev, the famous terrorist of Hezbollah, or Bin Laden, or Zarqawi, and other terrorists in the region. And his personal charisma was based on IRGC's propaganda to sell his face as a national hero, but he was a criminal only. And he was a bloodthirsty wolf in the darkness, and he caused an instability in the region. He had a very established ties and personal relationship with the Iranian regime leader, Ali Khamenei. And we can say that literally he was an icon of the regime's brutality. And his mindset was based on anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism. And we can ask right now, what is his legacy? The emergence of radicalism or Islamic terrorism in the region probably will be his legacy in the history.
How before moving on, I just had to ask, how detrimental do you think his killing is to the IRGC and Quds Force? In other words, has it set them back? If so, how far?
Personally, I believe it was a great decision because they wanted to eliminate his role in the field, in the battlefield, because he wanted to attack the American forces not only one time, many times. For the first time, it was 2007, that General David Petraeus announced publicly that this guy, he supported terrorist Shia groups in Iraq to kill the American forces or another Western allies. And in that moment, I was in Iraq. And he liked to use the Lebanon policy during the 1980s to put Americans under pressure to leave the country, because he believes from Afghanistan to Mediterranean Sea, it should be a land corridor for Iranian regime to shaping the Shia crescent in those countries. And personally, I was angry with the elimination of Qasem Soleimani because he was a bloodthirsty guy and he didn't respect the policies, the international norms, or he didn't care about the diplomacy logically. For the reason United States made the decision to eliminate this guy because he was not under the order.
And on that note, another subject that you've covered and spoken about in the past is Raisi, the current president of Iran. How do you think he fits into the internal, domestic, and external international politics of the region?
Ibrahim Raisi, right now, most of the think tanks in the world, specifically the Western think tanks, they like to analyze his character. But regarding Raisi, I can tell you that he is nobody. He is just a terrorist Shia mullah with radical mentality, who is now as a butcher of Tehran. And most of the members of the mullah's mafia in the country are accused of committing crime against humanity. One of them was the massacre of more than 5,000 Iranian political prisoners in 1988, which was taking place. And what happened in 1988 was a ruthless, bloody, and inconceivable massacre of political prisoners. And it was a horrible crime against humanity and could be termed genocide. So the fundamentalist theocracy led the execution of thousands of political prisoners in its custody and violating all international laws and norms. This guy has no education. He cannot read one paper correctly. And he has no legitimacy inside and outside Iran. And when you have a terrorist as a president, so surely there is no positive point in the public opinion regarding him. And personally, I believe he is just an icon to show the brutality of the regime in the world.
You see him as more of a puppet for other people behind the scenes.
If you pay attention to the Iranian public opinion, nobody likes him. And the radicals and moderates, or we can say reformists, they are the two sides of the same coin. And both of them, they like to preserve the regime, which is the mullah's regime. And there is no difference between them ideologically. So Raisi is just an instrument in the hands of leader that he wants to show, to run the show right now. But personally, Khamenei is the main actor in the political theater in Iran. And Raisi, I told you, is nobody.
Mm. And when it comes to the internal dynamics of what's happening in Iran, there's a lot of interesting thought in the West, maybe some of it true, maybe some of it not true. From your perspective as an analyst that focuses heavily on this subject, what is going on domestically inside Iran with the Iranian people? Do they want change? Are they primed for change? Is that even a political possibility at this time?
Actually, nowadays, it's a brutal theocratic regime that suppressed all peaceful protests inside the country. As an example, Persian Spring in 2009, that the presidential elections protests, even though they killed many people. And on 28 December 2017 to January 2018, additionally 3,700 demonstrators were arrested, and they killed hundreds of opponents. In 2019, 2020, Iranian protesters also, it's known the Bloody November, and as many as probably 1,500 Iranian protesters were killed brutally. Right now, the mullahs have no plan to manage the country, and they damage the environment of Iran, and they have no legitimacy in the West, and they try to waste the time for JCPOA, which is the nuclear deal with the current president of the United States, Biden. And now there is shortage of water because of the mullahs are against the modern technology. And last week, Iran forcefully clamps down on protests against the growing water shortage in Iran. So it was similar to the era of Aga Muhammad Khan Qajar historically. That guy was the founder of Qajar dynasty in Iran in 18th century. And one day he took revenge on the people of Kerman, which is a historical place in Iran. And he ordering eyes of 20,000 of inhabitants. So I mean, they pulling out thousands of eyes because the king was angry. And the city was brutally sacked and many beautiful buildings destroyed completely. Nowadays, Khamenei and the theocracies brutally and savageness, the agents of him shot the eyes of more than 33 people. Why? Because the people protest very peacefully and they ask why the country, they don't want to find a solution for the shortage of water. And now they are totally blind. And 200 or 300 protesters in Isfahan have been arrested just in this week. And Ministry of Intelligence Service, or MOIS, and IRGC, and police always rampage through all the peaceful protesters in Iran savagely. So for those reasons and examples that I told you historically, Khamenei, the current leader of Iran, has low legitimacy or validity in the public opinion in Iran.
Something else that you commented on that I've certainly read in the press over the last few years is that the Iranian regime has rolled up the CIA's intelligence assets in the country. We've read in the papers that we have increasingly had to rely on Mossad to do operations in Iran. What are your thoughts on those reports?
Due all my respect to American intelligence services, it's only for internal propaganda. Totally are absurd and groundless claims. MOIS is the supporter of transnational terrorist network in the globe, and they cannot have any competition with CIA or Mossad in Israel or MI6 in United Kingdom. Ridiculously, the mullahs of MOIS are directors of this notorious organization, have no background in security studies or intelligence studies. They are out there just to sign the orders to kill the opponents. As a specialist in counter-terrorism, let me tell you that CIA has a full information, and they know pretty well that what is the level of missiles program in Iran, what Iran are doing to support terrorism in the region, what is the production of drones, proxies, and something like that. So these bluffs of mullahs are ridiculous, and nobody can accept that. So this is just for propaganda in the media.
We've hit on the topic several times now. Why is it that the Iranians are sort of exporters and supporters of international terrorism? What are their foreign policy objectives in pushing that agenda?
We can see this issue academically, and the Islamic Republic of Iran is the outlaw regime which support terrorism within their armed forces, as many done with the IRGC or Quds Force or MOIS. And the mullahs regime abuse the international financial system and use commercial industry to fund and support terrorism. So they attack embassies in peacetime. They fuel terrorist militias. They serve as a sanctuary for terrorists. They call for destruction of Israel. And they proliferate missiles and to dangerous proxies in the region. and they couldn't cover most of the assassinations in other countries. They hold hostage citizens of the foreigners. So the brutal regime in Tehran squander their own natural resources and violently suppress legitimate protest always. They jail their own citizens and those of other countries on specious crime. They're engaging in torturing. They impose several restrictions in basic freedom. Since 1979, Iran Islamic Republic has made its policy, and actively they direct, facilitate, and carry out the terrorist activities globally. In Iran, they use IRGC, Quds Force, MYS, and proxies to advance the interests abroad. So they provide cover in intelligence operations. They create instability in the region. They attack US forces and Israelis. And Iran has involvement of the IRGC in the conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and most parts in the region. And they support terrorist proxies. And through the IRGC, they support several US-designated terrorist groups. They're providing funding, training, weapons, equipment. And beyond this, actually, Iran has provided weapons for most of them. For example, in the Shia groups in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Lebanon. And in addition to support the proxies, we can say the terrorist group abroad and the regime try to harbor terrorists. They help them to use Iran as a sanctuary. And so, for example, they have a strong relationship with Al-Qaeda. And most of the operatives reside in Iran. And they have been able to move money and fighters to South Asia. And Iran has ramped up its active involvement in the terrorism in the worldwide. So for the reason in Europe, in North America, in Asia, in Africa, they have these malign activities. And most of the Western intelligence organizations, they know that pretty well.
Excuse me. On that subject of Khomeiniism as an ideology, it's something that I feel like in the United States we don't talk about so much really since the 1980s, but it's still around there as a legacy in Iran. What is the relevancy of that ideology today for the Iranian people?
You know that before 1979, which was winter with no spring inside, before 1979, Shah, the late Shah or the king of Iran, was a close friend of the United States. Mm-hmm. They had a very friendly relationship with each other. CIA had more than 2 or 3 bases inside Iran. And the intelligence service of Iran, SAVAK, was the friend of CIA. And for example, George Bush, the father, he went to Iran and he was the special guest of SAVAK in Tehran. And he had a meeting with the Shah. For example, most of the presidents of the United States, like Nixon, like Jimmy Carter, they had relations with the king of Iran. After 1979, it was a chaotic situation in the region. And in studying of history, we can say Khomeini was an icon of the Iranian regime's policy. And Khomeinism is the ideology of the Khomeini, because Khomeini is the first caliphate of this regime before Khamenei, the current one. And the ideology of Khomeini is Khomeinism, that we can find out that Khomeinism is a mixture of more than 64 different schools, like absolutism, anarchism, barbarism, terrorism, radicalism. For the reason we call it Khomeinism. When Khomeinism is the mixture of 64 different schools. And you can imagine that how the modern Western countries, they try to have a deal with mullah's regime, who like to actually working based on this destructive ideology.
You've used this term before, the mullah's religious octopus. What does that mean exactly?
Octopus, if you know the biology, you know what I mean. But in today's Middle East, the mullah's religious has become the worst catastrophic in our age. And the situation in Iran, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and the consequences of advocating terrorism by Iran, they shape the new terrorism in the Middle East. So for the reason I use that term, and I use that term to show the people what does it mean, that why Iran, they are everywhere in the region. They wanted to destroy everywhere. For example, is not related to only the Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is the ideology of Iran, and they like to be the enemy of the United States and Israel in the modern world, just to show that they have acceptable ideology, but in the reality, which is ridiculous, and nobody can accept that. And the reason I use that item.
If it's okay, I'd like to ask you also like a sort of a personal question at this point. If you could tell us a little bit about who you are as a person and your professional background as a counterterrorism analyst. I'd really love to hear some more about yourself.
Oh yeah, I graduated in security studies in the United States in UCLA, and then I went to London University and I continued security studies also. And in Iraq, during that moment that I was the official biographer of the president of Iraq, I was working with the counter-terrorism of Iraq, and I had a very friendly relationship with American intelligence organization or analysts over there. And I research based on my field research in the Middle East regarding the Iranian transnational terrorist network. So specifically, I try to have studying in this issue. And probably I can say with 12 years experience, I try to continue this subject.
Erfan, you use that term Iraq, president of Iraq. If I called Kurdistan Iraq, my Kurdish friends would never let me hear the end of it. They would take me outside, and I don't think you would ever see Jack Murphy again. What's the difference in terminology? What does it mean to you?
But for me personally, I like to respect the territory. So Iraq is the main country, and United States, based on the international norms, they like to have a deal with central government. So the Americans, they never say that this is Kurdistan. No, for example, most of the American forces, when they came to Iraq, they had a very friendly relationship with the Kurds. And I'm Kurd of Iran. I'm not Kurd of Iraq, but I have, politically, I like to respect the central government.
No, I understand. And you're right. There's officially no country as Kurdistan, but for the Kurds are very nationalistic and they want their independence. And, I understand. But that's a difficult line politically for everyone in the region to kind of stand on both sides of, isn't it?
But right now, actually, most of the countries like Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, they use the Kurdish issue. They don't like to help them peacefully, and they like turmoil in the Kurdistan. And politically and economically, Kurdistan has no stable situation right now, and there are a kind of conflict between them. But we can say that they can participate in the central government to share the power, like Iraq, which is a very great pattern, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. So you worked in Iraq as a security analyst there?
Yeah, I was in Iraq as a security analyst, in London as a security analyst. And right now, many years, I wrote a lot of articles in Arabic or English. For example, from 2020 to 2021, I wrote in one of the Israeli think tanks, which is the Begin Sadat Strategic Center in Israel. So I like to write in Arabic and in English, and sometimes in Persian, and rarely in Kurdish language. So for the reason I like to write in 4 different languages.
You said your family is they're Persian Kurds.
Yeah, they are Iranian Kurds. Yeah,
Iranian Kurds. Yeah, it's perhaps one day we'll have to do another episode where we talk about the very complex Kurdish politics. It's almost too much to get into all the details here. We did have a few questions for you here. Someone asking about the Iranians, how do they manage and gain their funding? Do they have a sort of money laundering system for that?
They're like the FSB or other intel agencies help them with.
Yeah, I didn't get the point, actually.
In regards to the IRGC and the Quds Force, where do they derive their funding from? Do they use money laundering? How do they manage that?
Oh, yeah. Actually, they have proxies, and most of those proxies, they help Iran and for transferring the financial issues. And if you go back to the reports of the United States in the State Department or Treasury Department, they shows that very well. I'm not a specialist in that issue, but Iran, they use those proxies in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria to transferring the money. And specifically in Africa, Hezbollah, for example, has a lot of branches. In Latin American countries like Venezuela, Cuba, they use the offshore bank accounts, and they use, in Europe, actually, they have a bunch of dark cells. And unfortunately, the European countries, they are not so strong to control most of them, specifically in Scandinavian countries, in Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, Finland, Austria, Germany, under the umbrella of the Islamic centers. So these groups, they transfer monies. And this is right now a very great issue for the intelligence services in United States or in Europe to control those kind of offshores bank accounts.
Andrew asks, he wants to ask about the Iran deal, the so-called Iran deal, as we called it, the U.S. deal with Iran. What was your feelings about that deal that was hashed out during the Obama administration? Was it a good idea, a bad idea? What's your analysis on it?
I believe it was the only achievement of the President Obama in that moment, because President Obama, he didn't have a very great achievement historically. And JCPOA was the only achievement that he got politically. But I don't believe mullahs, and I believe that they try to waste the time. Mm-hmm. And right now, in the Biden administration, I wrote that very publicly, that dealing with the criminal mullahs is wasting the time. And this is a kind of dead horse, and you cannot use it again. For the reason JCPOA is just wasting the time, and they cannot trust the mullahs, the terrorist-loving mullahs in Tehran, that they killed Americans, they are against the stability of the modern world. So JCPOA is only wasting time. This is my answer.
What do you think would be the correct policy approach? Because we don't want to invade Iran and implode that country the way we did with Iraq. We have sanctioned the ever-living hell of Iran, and that hasn't really gotten us the desired effect. What would be the subsequent steps for the United States or for the West to take in their approach towards the Iranian regime?
Unfortunately, we can say that only, for example, I can say you one example historically. During 1979, so for example, 1 year before the revolution, or I don't like to use a revolution anyway, because it was a plot of the terrorist groups, Islamic terrorist groups transnationally. But anyway, Jimmy Carter was the friend of Shah, and he had no information regarding the revolution. And amazingly, Central Intelligence Agency and Defense Intelligence Agency in the United States, they had no clue that what's going to happen in Iran. They published in their books, and so every listeners, they can go to those books and they know exactly they had no information about the revolution. And amazingly, one guy in the CIA, he had an interview with me, and he said, we didn't have any books regarding Khomeini. We didn't know who is this guy, which is true. And this is one of the examples. Another example, it was during the President Reagan in the United States, that William Casey was the director of the CIA. From one side, they helped the Iranian opposition to overthrow the Khomeini. From another side, it was Iran-Contra deal to selling the weapons. So this is a kind of, paradoxically, we can say this is a kind of contradiction. The third one was the time of President Bill Clinton, that he liked to respect the Iranian culture. He liked to make a deal with Iran, but Iran, they wanted to waste the time only. At the time of George Bush, so because the Secretary of State was Dr. Rice, and Dr. Rice, she had a positive attitude and opinion to open the doors to Iranian young generation. She was very successful. And Condoleezza Rice helped the Iranian artists to have the exhibition in Washington, D.C., which was excellent and fantastic in that moment in 2007 or 2008. But this regime, they don't like to make a relationship with the United States. So the only way for the United States, I believe, is supporting the young generation and opposition to overthrow this regime. Because with this regime, never ever you can find a stability and peace in the region. And the U.S. embassy cannot be reopened once more in the country. So personally, I believe without mullahs and radical Shia mullahs, we can have another friendly relationship once more.
Jim asks, do you think Persian nationalism, Shiism, or power politics affect why Iran conducts terror attacks overseas?
It is completely different, and Persian nationalism is different because historically in the world, we have 5 or 6 countries that they have thousands years history. It's like China, it's like Greece, Egypt, Iran. So they had a very great legendary history. But mullahs, they gain the power and wealth, and they like to stay in power, and they are separate from Iran. And Iranian people are separate from this regime because this regime is not a representative of the Iranian people. The Iranian people, they hate this regime. And mullahs' regime are a bunch of dictators that they wanted to make a chaos in everywhere in the world. They don't want to have a very moderate relationship with the modern world. No, not at all, because they like to make a chaos in everywhere. For example, in Lebanon, in Syria, because they say the United States is enemy of Islam, which is not true. They say United States is enemy of Iran, which is not true. And right now in California, thousands of Iranians are living here peacefully, and they are in the society of the United States without any problem.
What do you make of the region that the Kurds call Rojava, the area of Syria, northeastern Syria? Do you think that is a sustainable state for the Kurdish people, or is it more of a pipe dream, something that will never really come true?
Actually, it's not completely true. Unfortunately, in that moment, the Kurds, they had a deal with American forces from one side, and from another side, they were protector of Bashar Assad, because Bashar Assad said that we will support the independence of Kurdistan after the civil war, which was not true. And unfortunately, they lose the game. And in that moment, the Kurds, they had a relationship with Pentagon, CIA, US forces, and from another side, they had a relationship with IRGC and Syria government. And so I believe that President Trump, he made a correct decision, and he said goodbye forever. And right now, what they have, what they gain, nothing. And this is a very poor place right now with nothing. And they have no wealth, they have no power. And it is ridiculous that we can say that most of the political groups over there right now, they are protector of Bashar Assad, which is a bloodthirsty dictator in Syria.
Last question from our viewers. Are the Iranians buying weapons directly from the Chinese?
Actually, we should ask the intelligence organizations to answer this question with detail. But I can tell you only that the mutual point between Russia, China, and Iran is enmity with the United States. So Iran right now, because of the enmity toward the United States, likes to play in the game with China and Russia. So we can say Marxism and Shia radical is the two sides of the same coin right now. Mm-hmm. So personally, I believe Iran is an instrument in the hands of Russia. So we cannot say that Iran has something like this with China or Russia. No, only they want to have this relationship because of the United States, because they don't want to have a relationship with the United States right now. So they open the doors to China and Russia, and the Iranian people, they hate this decision.
Before we start wrapping things up, I mean, do you have anything, Dave, or Fawn? Do you have any final points or things I failed to ask that maybe you'd like to talk about?
I'm curious. What do you think? And I know this is conjecture and hypothesis, but Iran has such a rich history, like you said, right? I mean, it's art, it's mathematics, it's science, it's culture, and in for so many years, it was like this beacon of, advanced thinking and education. And now it's we kind of in this state of barbarism due to the Ayatollah and the mullahs and whatnot. What do you think it will take for the Persian people and the soldiers, right? The forces who are also Persians, like, at what point do you think that they'll ever say it's enough and be done with the mullahs? Or what do you think it would take for that to happen?
If we pay attention to the world, for example, to find a similar pattern, we can say in Egypt, they had a great army that they tried to protect the state in the Arab Spring in that moment. In Libya, the military, they like to help the civil society. But in Iran, it's completely different because the Shia mullahs, they like to destroy everything and they never, ever respect the human rights, which is a problem. Mm-hmm. And another problem is the modern Western medias, for example, they never try to show the reality and they like to use the propaganda of the regime. For example, in New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, they never say Ali Khamenei, the dictator of Iran. They will say Ayatollah Khamenei. Yeah. And if I ask any journalist in the United States, what is the meaning of Ayatollah? They have no answer. Right. The meaning of Ayatollah, it means sign of God. This is adjective. So, and a watermelon, a cucumber, a tomato can be a sign of God too. So why we use this adjective always, for what? And why they respect the dictator? This is the main question. But unfortunately, if we ask New York Times, they will say that, no, we are independent. But they are not. If we ask Washington Post, most of my friends, they are working in those medias. And when I ask them, hey guys, this is a terrorist attack, they didn't want to use radical Islam. They didn't like to use the term of terrorism. So I believe we need a kind of new, we can say, movement to show the people that what is the reality. And it takes time. Mm-hmm. And it is a long road to democracy in Iran to clear the mullahs. And unfortunately, the militaries in Iran are the instrument in the hands of mullah to shape the power that they like. They don't want it to preserve Iran. They didn't like to preserve the civilization. No, not at all.
Erfan, your new book is called The Gruesome Mullah. Where can people find it?
I think from tomorrow, it will be available in Amazon, in Kindle, or in Apple Books, and most of them. And the publisher is in California. And so he told me that from tonight and tomorrow, the Amazon will be available.
The Gruesome Mullah. And Michael Morell actually wrote
an excerpt or a word for it.
Yeah.
Actually, this is my honor, my great honor, and it is my pleasure that Mike Morell endorsed that. I should appreciate three directors of the Central Intelligence Agency: General Mike Hayden, General David Petraeus, and the third one, Mike Morell. So it is my honor to have them. And I wrote one article regarding General David Petraeus in the book, which is about his prediction in 2007. And he said, Iran will use radicalism to destroy the stability of Middle East. He was completely right.
Yeah.
So I wrote one article about him in the book.
We really appreciate you joining us tonight and sharing your insights with us, Erfan. And I hope we can have you back sometime when the subject of Iran and Iraq and the region comes up again.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you, Erfan.